Today I'm telling you a story so quiet it screams a story of poison that healed of hate, that hesitated, and of one man who chose the hardest road without ever asking for thanks. Out where the mesas throw long shadows and men carry their prejudices like loaded guns, the line between savior and suspect is razor thin. It began in the cruelest heat of day, with a woman collapsing in the street and 5 words that would change 2 lives forever. Please, put it in my mouth. 1 berry, 1 breath, and the beginning of a reckoning no one saw coming. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The sun hammered down on Mescalero Crossing like a blacksmith's mallet, turning the air thick and metallic. Dust hung in lazy spirals, stirred only by the slow creak of wagon wheels and the occasional snort of a horse too tired to care. Kai rode in at a walk, the shadow of horse and rider stretching long and thin across the cracked earth. He kept his eyes forward, jaw set, the familiar weight of stairs already pressing against his shoulders. He'd come for bullets and jerked beef, nothing more. Get in, get out before the afternoon burned everything to ash. The street felt wrong, too quiet in the wrong places. A loose knot of settlers stood outside the trading post, shoulders hunched, voices low and tight. They weren't laughing, weren't haggling. They were watching something in the center of their half-circle, and the silence around that something was louder than any shout. Kai eased the horse to a stop near the hitch rail. He swung down boots, touching dirt with the soft thud of someone who knew better than to announce himself. Every eye flicked his way, some curious, most wary. A few hands drifted toward belt guns, then hesitated. He ignored them, looped the reins, and started toward the store. That was when he saw her. She stood in the middle of the crowd, like a willow caught in a flash flood. Nora Kane, the new schoolteacher hair plastered to her temple's face, flushed and angry red lips, cracked and pale. Her hand clutched at her throat, the other trembled at her side. She swayed, knees buckling, eyes glassy and unfocused. Heat stroke bad, the kind that killed fast out here. Kai's step faltered. He could keep walking, could pretend he hadn't seen. The settlers would handle their own, or they wouldn't. Either way, it wouldn't be his trouble. But she was falling. He moved before the thought finished. Quiet steps measured cutting through the reluctant parting of bodies. Whispers followed him like flies Apache. What's he doing? Careful now. A rancher Jed Crow crossed his arms, thumb brushing the grip of his revolver. Kai felt the shift in the air, the way the whole street seemed to cock itself like a hammer. He reached her just as her legs gave. One hand caught her elbow steady but light, the other hovered near her shoulder, ready to pull back if she flinched. She didn't. Instead, she turned toward him, eyes swimming, and her free hand lifted, shaking so hard the small red berry in her palm trembled. Please. Her voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the wind. Put it in my mouth. The words landed like a stone in still water. A woman gasped. Someone muttered, Lord. A cowhand snickered, then choked it off when no one joined him. Kai froze, not from the words themselves he'd heard worse, but from the way every gaze snapped to him, sharp and accusing, as though he'd already crossed a line no one had bothered to draw. Nora's fingers brushed his sleeve again, weak, desperate. The berry sat in her open palm, small, pale red, shriveled at the edges. Waterheart, he thought. Common enough along the creek beds. Settlers used them for heat. Harmless. He looked into her face, cracked lips, shallow breaths scraping like sandpaper, and something in him gave way. Not pity. Recognition. He'd seen men die under this sun before. Seen women, too. Kai knelt one knee in the dust. He steadied her with a hand on her shoulder, took the berry between thumb and forefinger. Her eyes fluttered shut in something like trust. Easy, he murmured. He lifted the berry to her mouth. She parted her lips just enough. He placed it on her tongue. She swallowed weak once. For a heartbeat, the world held still. The crowd sucked in air. Nora's shoulders eased a fraction. Then her eyes snapped open, two wide pupils swallowing the light. A tremor ran through her, delicate at first, then sharp like a wire pulled taut and suddenly released. Kai's stomach dropped. He knew that look. Red fire stingberry, not waterheart. The wrong berry. And he had just put it in her mouth. The silence that followed was worse than any shout. The dust still swirled where Kai had knelt, clinging to his knees like a second skin. Nora's weight leaned heavier against his arm, now her breaths coming in shallow, ragged pulls that scraped the back of his throat just to hear. The crowd had closed in tighter, without seeming to move, boots, scuffing spurs, chiming once, then falling silent. The smell of hot horsehair and old leather mixed with the sharp tang of sweat-soaked cotton. No one spoke above a murmur, but the murmurs were growing teeth. Kai kept his left hand under her shoulder, steady but careful, the way you hold a bird with a broken wing. His right hovered near the worn grip of the old Colt at his hip, not quite touching, just close enough to feel the sun-warmed steel. He could feel the eyes boring into his back. Jed Crow's stare like a branding iron, Rusty Boone's nervous, shifting the low mutter of a woman somewhere behind them. No Cal Decker yet. The sheriff never showed when you needed him quick. Nora's fingers twitched against his sleeve. Her palm opened wider, offering the berry again, small and pale red edges curled in, like it had been waiting too long in the heat. Kai's gaze flicked down. Waterheart? He'd seen settlers pick them along the dry creek beds, pop them in their mouths when the sun got mean. Harmless. Cooling. The kind of thing a schoolteacher from back east might trust without thinking twice. He swallowed once, throat dry as the street. Helping her meant touching her in front of every man, woman, and child who already looked at him like he carried plague. Letting her fall meant watching her die slow while they stood there deciding whose fault it was. He'd seen both choices play out before. Neither ended clean. Her head lolled against his shoulder. A soft sound escaped her, half plea, half sob. Please. Kai's jaw tightened. He lifted the berry between thumb and finger, the skin thin and slightly tacky against his calluses. He brought it to her cracked lips. She parted them just enough. He placed it on her tongue. She closed her mouth. Swallowed once weak, the motion barely visible. For a single breath, her shoulders eased the awful tension bleeding out like air from a punctured canteen. Her eyelids fluttered shut. Relief fragile and fleeting. The crowd exhaled as one. A woman, maybe May Harlan, whispered something that sounded like thanks. Then Nora's eyes snapped open. Not gradual, sudden. Pupils blown wide black, swallowing the hazel until nothing human looked back. A tremor started in her hands, traveled up her arms, shook through her whole frame like a wire plucked hard. Her breath hitched sharp and wrong. A low sound came from her throat, not pain, not fear, something wilder, something that didn't belong in a schoolteacher's mouth. Kai felt it in his bones before his mind named it. Not Waterheart. Red fire stingberry. The wrong one. The one that burned through the blood and lit up the mind like dry grass under a torch. He didn't move. Didn't breathe. The hand still on her shoulder stayed there steady, even as his pulse hammered against his ribs. Nora stared past him, through him, at something only she could see. Her lips parted. A soft, broken laugh slipped out light at first, then jagged wrong. The crowd froze. Jed Crow's arms dropped. Rusty Boone took one step back. And in the sudden, terrible quiet, Kai felt the weight of every eye shift from suspicion to something darker. He had just fed her poison, and everyone had watched him do it. The laughter started small, a soft hiccuping thing that didn't belong to the woman Kai had just fed a berry. It bubbled up from Nora's chest light and clear at first, like a child discovering something wonderful, then twisted, stretched thin and wrong until it sounded like glass cracking underfoot. She swayed harder now, boots scraping the dry boards of the trading post porch. Her head tilted back, eyes wide and glassy, darting from the sky to the dirt to the faces ringing them. "Everything's glowing," she whispered, voice dreamy, almost reverent. "The ground, it's moving, like water under glass." Kai's arms tightened around her waist without thinking. He felt the tremor ripple through her ribs, felt the heat pouring off her skin like a fever stove. His mouth tasted bitter still, the ghost of that berry he'd handed her. He knew the signs. Red fire stingberry didn't just cool the blood, it set it alight. He'd seen a boy in his own camp once years back chew one on a dare. The boy had laughed until he screamed, then stared at nothing for 3 days straight. Kai had been too young to help then. He wasn't too young now. The crowd had pulled back a half-step, boots scuffing in unison. Someone muttered, "Possessed." May Harlan's lips moved in silent prayer, fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. Jed Crow's voice cut through the hush, low and hard. "What did you give her, Apache?" Kai didn't answer. He couldn't. His left arm locked around Nora's middle to keep her upright. His right hand stayed near his hip, useless against the weight of 20 pairs of eyes. The posture looked wrong, too close, too possessive, and he knew exactly how it looked to them. His fingers trembled just once, a small betrayal he felt all the way to his teeth. Nora's head snapped toward the street. Cal Decker had finally appeared, shirt half-tucked, hat crooked, face flushed from a run or a nap interrupted. He stopped short when he saw her. She pointed, arm shaking. "Sheriff, your face is melting." Cal's hand flew to his cheek on pure reflex. His fingers pressed hard as if he could feel the skin sliding off bone. Color drained from his face in a rush. "My what?" Nora laughed again, bright, wild, nothing like the quiet schoolteacher who'd arrived 3 weeks earlier with a carpet bag and a polite smile. The sound sliced through the afternoon heat, jagged and wrong, and the crowd flinched as one. Then she moved. 1 second she was leaning into Kai's hold. The next she jerked free with surprising strength, skirts whipping as she stumbled toward the row of wagons parked beside the store. Her boots kicked up dust in frantic puffs. She reached the nearest one, grabbed a spoke, and started climbing hand-over-hand, skirts catching on the wheel rim, boots slipping, then finding purchase again. "I'm flying!" she called, voice rising with delight. "Look, the sky is an ocean!" Kai lunged after her, heart slamming against his ribs. The wagon creaked under her weight. She reached the roof, straightened arms flung wide like wings. The sun haloed her hair, turning it to fire. Below, the crowd sucked in a collective breath. A few hands drifted toward holsters, half-drawn, uncertain. Rusty Boone's mouth hung open. Jed Crow's face darkened. Kai reached the wagon side boots, planted in the dirt, one hand gripping the tailgate. He looked up at her swaying silhouette, the wood groaning beneath her feet, and felt the first real fear crawl cold up his spine, not for himself, but for the woman who thought she could walk on air. She laughed once more, pure and terrible, and the wagon rocked. The wagon groaned like an old man settling into a grave. Nora stood atop the roof, now boots planted wide, skirts billowing in the hot wind that carried the scent of dry sage and horse sweat. Her arms stretched out, fingers splayed, as if she could catch the sky itself. The sun struck her hair and turned it to flame, and for a moment she looked almost holy until she laughed again, that bright, fractured sound that made the hair rise on Kai's neck. "I'm sailing," she called, voice carrying over the street. "The ground is so far away." The wagon shifted under her weight. One front wheel sank deeper into the soft dust, the axle creaking in protest. The boards beneath her feet flexed, splintering faintly at the edges. Kai's hands were already on the tailgate knuckles, white against the sun-bleached wood. He pulled himself up, boots scraping for purchase on the side slats, every muscle taut. The fear hit him low and hard, not the familiar wariness of a crowd with guns, but something sharper. The image of her body hitting the ground from that height, bones snapping like dry twigs, blood pooling in the dust while everyone watched. He had never felt this kind of helplessness before, not when he'd ridden through ambushes, not when he'd watched kin die under soldiers' rifles. This was different. This was a woman he didn't know who'd trusted him with a single berry, and now she was dancing on the edge of death because of his mistake. The crowd had backed off another step, forming a ragged half-moon. A few hands hovered near holsters. Rusty Boone's fingers twitching Jed Crow's thumb, brushing the hammer of his revolver. No one spoke. The only sounds were the wagon's slow complaints, Nora's breathless laughter, and the distant creak of a windmill turning lazily at the edge of town. Kai reached the roof's edge, one knee braced on the narrow lip. He had to let go of the Colt at his hip to grip the wood with both hands. The motion left him exposed back to the street shirt, clinging damp to his spine. If anyone decided to shoot now, he wouldn't even have time to turn. Nora spun in a slow circle, arms still wide. She looked down at him, eyes shining with colors only she could see. "Taza," she said softly, the name slipping out like a secret she'd just remembered. "Are you flying too?" The word, his old name, not the one he used here, cut deeper than he expected. He didn't know how she knew it, or if she even did. The red fire was burning through her mind, pulling up fragments, twisting them. He swallowed the ache it left in his chest. "No one is flying," he said, voice low and steady. "Come down." She tilted her head, as if considering the idea from a great distance. Then she leaned forward just a little, just enough. The wagon protested with a sharp, splintering crack. The roof bowed under her shifting weight. Dust sifted down from the seams. The front axle tilted wheel groaning as it settled deeper. Kai lunged, his arms wrapped around her waist from behind, hard and sure, pulling her back against his chest. She gasped, startled, her body stiffening for a heartbeat before going limp against him. The wagon lurched violently, boards creaking the whole frame, shuddering like it might collapse. Below, the crowd held its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. Kai's heart hammered against her shoulder blades. He could feel her pulse racing under his grip, wild, erratic, alive. The wagon steadied, but only just. One more shift, and it would go over. He didn't let go. The wagon had stopped rocking, but the echo of that last creak hung in the air like a warning shot. Kai's arms stayed locked around Nora's waist, her back pressed hard against his chest. She was lighter than he expected, trembling like a colt in a thunderstorm, her breath coming in quick, uneven bursts that warmed the hollow of his throat. The sun baked the wagon roof beneath them, heat rising through the boards and into his knees. Dust drifted up in slow clouds, sticking to the sweat on his skin. He shifted his weight carefully, inch by inch, guiding her toward the edge. One arm slid lower to brace her hips. The other stayed across her ribs, feeling the frantic flutter of her heart. She didn't fight him now, just leaned, trusting in that blind, broken way the red fire gave. Her hair smelled of chalk dust and faint lavender soap mixed with the sharp bite of fear sweat. He hated how close she was, hated more that he couldn't let go. "Hold on," he murmured, voice rough in his own ears. Nora's fingers clutched at his forearm nails, digging through the thin cotton of his sleeve. Everything's spinning." She whispered the words, slurred and distant. "I can't. Stay with me," he said, low and steady. "It's the berry. Just the berry." He eased them both down the side of the wagon one boot, finding the spoke, then the tailgate, then the ground. The drop jarred his knees. He took her full weight as her feet touched dirt, letting his body cushion hers. Dust puffed up around their boots, settling slow on the hem of her skirt. For a moment they stood like that, her forehead against his collarbone, his arms still wrapped around her, both breathing hard in the sudden stillness. Cold sweat traced a line down Kai's spine. He'd faced rifles before faced men who wanted him dead, but nothing had ever felt this close to slipping out of his hands. She was alive. For now. And every second he held her, the price climbed higher. The crowd had tightened again, a wall of sun-browned faces and narrowed eyes. Cal Decker pushed forward, belt half-buckled hand resting heavy on the butt of his Colt. "What did you do to her, Apache?" His voice carried the gravel of too much whiskey and too little sleep. Jed Crow stepped up beside him, shoulders squared. "She's out of her mind because of you." Kai lifted his right hand, slow palm open, fingers spread peace, not threat. The motion left him holding Nora entirely with his left arm, her weight sagging against his side. His gun hand was empty now, useless if things turned. He felt the absence like a missing tooth. Nora's head lolled against his shoulder. She stared up at him with eyes that didn't quite see pupils still wide and black. A stranger's gaze in a face he'd only nodded to in passing. He could let go. Step back. Let the settlers take her, drag her to the doctor or the preacher or wherever they thought madness belonged. She might get hurt in the scramble. Might not. But he'd be clear. One less mark against him. Or he could keep holding on. Keep her upright. Keep answering for what he'd done. Her fingers tightened on his sleeve again, a small, desperate clutch. Kai's jaw worked once. Then he shifted his grip, turning her toward the trading post door. The crowd parted, just enough grumbling suspicious, but not yet ready to lay hands. He guided her inside her boots, dragging faint lines in the dust. The door shut behind them with a solid thunk. He slid the bolt. Almost immediately, the pounding started, fists on wood, voices rising. "Open up. We need to see her." Inside, the dim cool wrapped around them like a held breath. Kai leaned Nora against the counter, one hand still on her arm. Outside, the knocking grew louder. The trading post smelled of old burlap saddle soap and the faint metallic bite of gun oil. Thin shafts of late-afternoon sun sliced through the shutter cracks, striping the plank floor in gold and shadow. Kai eased Nora down onto the single ladder-back chair behind the counter, her legs folded like wet paper. She slumped forward, elbows on her knees, head hanging. He knelt in front of her, one hand steady on her forearm to keep her from tipping sideways. Her breathing was shallow, erratic. Each inhale a small gasp that rattled in her chest. Every few seconds her shoulders jerked a faint tremor that ran through her like distant thunder. Her eyes darted unfocused, chasing shapes only she could see. The pupils were still huge black pools swallowing the hazel. Kai watched the way her fingers twitched against the armrest's nails, scraping wood, and the certainty settled in his gut like cold lead. Red fire stingberry. Not just a mistake, a bad one. He knew the plant too well grew in the deep canyons used sparingly by his people for visions when the world needed to be seen differently. In the wrong hands under the wrong sun, it burned the mind clean. He'd seen a man once years back chew too much during a drought ritual. The man had wandered off laughing and never come back the same. Kai had helped search for the body, never found it. Now the same poison was eating Nora Kane alive. If the night came without night sage, She might stay lost forever, trapped in colors and spinning ground, talking to ghosts that wore familiar faces. The thought hit harder than he expected. He didn't know her, had only ever nodded once or twice when she passed on the boardwalk, books under her arm, polite smile for everyone. But he'd put the berry in her mouth. That made it his. Outside, the pounding on the front door grew louder, fists hammering wood in uneven rhythm. Voices overlapped, angry, frightened, demanding. "She's dying in there, let us in!" A woman's voice. May Harlan's cut through the noise, sharp with worry. He's helping her, Cal. Let him be. Kai's shoulders ached. He had one arm braced across Nora's chest now, pinning her gently to the chair as she tried to rise, muttering something about the walls breathing. Her body fought him without intent, weak but stubborn. Sweat soaked through his shirt, dark patches, spreading across his back and under his arms. His legs burned from holding position. He could feel the tremor in his own muscles now, the slow creep of exhaustion. He looked at her. Really looked. Her face was pale beneath the flush lips, cracked eyes glassy, but still flickering with something human underneath the haze. She was scared. Deep down beneath the visions, she knew something was terribly wrong. "I have to go," he said, voice low, almost lost in the racket outside. "Night Sage is the only thing that can save you." Nora's hand shot out, fingers closing around his wrist. Her grip was weak, trembling but desperate. "Don't leave me." The words came out small, cracked, the first clear thing she'd said since the berry touched her tongue. Kai's throat tightened. He didn't answer right away. Just stared at her hand on his skin, pale fingers against his darker wrist, and felt the weight of the choice press down heavier than the sun outside. He rose slowly, legs protesting. The back door was only a few steps away, a narrow slab of weathered pine with a simple iron latch. He crossed to it, boots soft on the boards, and lifted the latch. The door swung open on dry hinges. Beyond it lay the open land arroyo cutting towards the Black Range mesas, rising dark and jagged against the orange bleed of sunset. The canyon waited full of rattlesnakes and narrow trails, and the one plant that might pull her back from the edge. Behind him, the front door shuddered under another volley of blows. From the street came the sharp crack of a warning shot, single deliberate echoing across the rooftops. Kai stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dying light hand still on the latch. He didn't move yet, but he didn't close the door either. The lamp on the counter guttered low, throwing weak orange light across the shelves of canned goods and bolt cloth. Shadows pooled in the corners like spilled ink. Kai stood at the back door, reins already coiled in his fist, the horse waiting just outside, with its head low and ears flicking at the noise. His saddlebags hung light, only water a knife, and the thin hope of finding Night Sage before full dark. He could still smell the faint bitterness of the berry on his own tongue, a ghost taste that wouldn't leave. Nora sat slumped in the chair knees, drawn up, arms wrapped tight around herself, as if holding her own pieces together. Her body jerked every few seconds, small, helpless spasms that made the chair legs scrape the floorboards. Her eyes still shimmered with that unnatural brightness, pupils wide enough to drown in. She looked small, fragile, and far too quiet for the storm raging inside her. The front door rattled again, harder this time. Wood groaned under repeated blows. Cal Decker's voice came through thick with authority, and something close to panic. "Open this door, or we'll break it down." Jed Crow's shout followed raw and accusing. "He poisoned her. I saw him put something in her mouth." Kai's hand tightened on the reins until the leather bit into his palm. If he stayed, the door would give, eventually. They'd drag him out, maybe shoot him first and ask questions after. He'd seen crowds turn before seeing good men become nothing more than targets when fear got loud enough. If Nora died tonight, or woke up tomorrow with her mind gone, the blame would land square on him. No one would care about the wrong berry, only that an Apache had been the one to feed it to her. If he left, though, he left her here, alone with a mob that thought they were saving her by breaking in and hauling him away. She might fight them in her delirium, might get hurt worse, might not last the night at all. His gaze dropped to the Winchester leaning against the counter. The rifle had ridden with him for years, steady familiar, the one thing he could trust when everything else turned sideways. He lifted her hand gently from his wrist and placed it back on the arm of the chair. Her fingers curled weakly around the wood, as if trying to hold on to something solid. Kai turned, pushed the back door open with his shoulder. Cool evening air rushed in, carrying the scent of pignon and cooling rock. The horse snorted once, impatient. Beyond the alley, the black range loomed black teeth against the bruised purple of the sky. He stepped out, swung into the saddle in one smooth motion. The reins slapped against his palm. From the front of the building came the sharp crack of a single-shot warning fire aimed at the sky. The sound rolled across the rooftops, flat and final. Kai touched his heels to the horse's flanks. The animal lunged forward, hooves pounding dirt, carrying him straight into the gathering dark of the canyon mouth. Behind him, the door swung shut on its own latch, clicking softly into place. There was no turning back now. The moon hung low and thin over the black range, a sliver of pale bone casting just enough light to turn the rocks silver and the shadows black. The trail was little more than a goat path, narrow, uneven, strewn with loose shale that shifted under the horse's hooves. Kai rode at a walk reins slack, letting the animal pick its way. Every few steps the horse's ears flicked forward, listening to things Kai couldn't hear yet. The night air had turned cold, sharp enough to sting the skin on his forearms where his sleeves were rolled. It carried the dry scent of juniper and dust undercut by something older, something reptilian. He no longer questioned the choice. The moment he'd spurred the horse away from the trading post, the hesitation had burned off like morning fog. What remained was simple and brutal. Nora would die if he failed. Or worse, she'd live but never come back to herself. The thought didn't make him feel noble. It made him feel trapped. Every creak of the saddle, every scrape of hoof on stone, reminded him how far he'd ridden from the life he'd tried to keep small and quiet. No more watching from the edges. No more slipping away before trouble noticed him. Trouble had noticed, and it had followed him into the dark. A faint, dry rattle drifted up from the brush to his left rattlesnake, close warning without threat yet. Kai's hand tightened on the reins, slowing the horse to a stop. The sound came again, longer this time, a slow, deliberate buzz that raised the fine hairs on his neck. He knew where the night sage grew low along the canyon walls, near the warm rock where rattlers liked to coil at dusk. He'd gathered it before for fevers, for wounds. Never at night, never alone. He swung down boots, touching the ground with a soft crunch. The horse snorted once, blowing warm air against his shoulder, then stood still, ears pricked. Kai looped the reins over a low branch, patted the animal's neck, once more habit than comfort, and started forward on foot. Each step was deliberate, slow testing the ground before committing weight. His legs ached from the long ride muscles, stiff and burning. Sweat from the afternoon had dried cold against his back. Now fresh sweat prickled along his hairline. Time was bleeding away faster than he could walk. The trail narrowed, forcing him to sidestep rocks and duck under overhanging scrub. Another rattle closer off to the right. He froze, breath held, listening. The sound stopped. Then started again, softer, almost curious. He moved again, one careful foot after the other, eyes scanning the moonlit ground. There. A low cluster of nightsage hugged the base of a boulder, silvery leaves catching the pale light like scattered coins. Relief flickered through him, brief and thin. He took one step closer and stopped. Curled in the shadow of the sage no more than 2 feet away, a rattlesnake lay thick and dark body looped in lazy coils. Its head lifted slowly, tongue flicking out twice tasting the air. The rattle began again, slow at first, then steady, a low, insistent warning that filled the narrow space between the rocks. Kai stood perfectly still. His heart thudded against his ribs, steady but loud in his ears. The snake's eyes were black beads reflecting moonlight, unblinking. It didn't strike, not yet. But it was watching. He could back away, retreat to the horse ride back empty-handed. Let the night sage stay where it was. Let the crowd have their way with him and with her. Nora might survive the night, might not. But he'd still be breathing tomorrow. Or he could take one more step. The rattle grew louder, vibrating through the stone under his boots. Kai didn't move. Not yet. The snake's tail blurred in the moonlight, the sound rising, filling the canyon like a question no one wanted to answer. The night had thickened in the narrow cleft of the black range. Moonlight filtered through the scrub in thin, cold slivers, turning the sage leaves to pale silver and the rocks to black iron. Kai knelt on one knee in the dirt, left hand braced against the boulder for balance. Right hand extended slow and deliberate toward the low cluster of night sage. The plant's leaves trembled faintly in the breeze as if they knew what was coming. The rattlesnake lay coiled no more than a foot from the base of the bush, thick-bodied and dark, its rattle a steady low buzz that vibrated through the ground and into Kai's bones. The snake's head had lifted higher now, tongue flicking out in short black darts, tasting the air between them. It wasn't angry, yet just watchful. But Kai had seen enough rattlers to know the line was thin. One tremor in his hand, one sudden breath too loud, and it would cross that line. Fear had burned away somewhere on the ride in. What remained was something colder, sharper, absolute focus. No room for doubt, no space for anything but the next inch. If the snake struck and found flesh, he'd die here alone, bleeding out in the dark while the horse wandered off. And Nora would die back in Mescalero Crossing, or worse, wake up tomorrow with her mind still locked in that spinning, glowing hell. The thought didn't make him brave. It made him still. He breathed once slow and deep, filling his lungs with the cold, resin-sharp air. His right hand moved again, fingers open, steady, no glove, no protection. The first leaf brushed his fingertips. He pinched it, gently twisted, once felt the faint snap of the stem. A small drop of blood welled where a thorn had caught the side of his thumb. He ignored it. The snake's rattle quickened the sound, rising in pitch, a warning that filled the narrow space like smoke. Another leaf, another careful twist. Blood smeared the silver-green surface dark against the moonlight. The snake's head swayed slightly, following the motion of his hand. Kai kept his eyes on the coils, on the flat, unblinking stare, never on the leaves themselves. Time had slowed to the crawl of sap through dry wood, each heartbeat loud in his ears, each rustle of fabric against stone amplified. He reached for a third leaf, the one that would make enough. The rattle exploded sharp, furious, a blur of sound. The snake lunged. Kai rolled left shoulder, hitting the dirt, hard body curling away as the strike hissed past his arm. Fangs scraped stone instead of skin. The snake recoiled, head whipping back, rattle screaming. Pain flared in his elbow where it had struck the rock, but he was already moving, scrambling to his feet, snatching the 3 leaves from the bush in one desperate sweep. More thorns tore his skin. More blood welled. He didn't feel it. He stuffed the leaves into the small leather pouch at his belt, fingers shaking now that the moment had broken. The snake coiled again, head-high rattle still buzzing, but it didn't strike a second time. Maybe it had spent its warning. Maybe it simply didn't care anymore. Kai backed away slow at first, then faster boots crunching shale. He reached the horse in 3 long strides, swung into the saddle without using the stirrup, and turned the animal's head toward the trail mouth. The horse lunged forward, hooves digging into the loose dirt. They broke into a trot, then a canter, the canyon walls falling away behind them. Wind whipped cold against Kai's face, drying the sweat and the blood on his hands. Far ahead, faint but unmistakable, a distant crack split the night, another gunshot from Mescalero Crossing. Not close enough to be aimed at him. Not yet. But the sound rolled across the open land like a summons. The crowd was losing patience. Kai leaned low over the horse's neck, urging it faster down the dark trail. The night sage rested heavy in the pouch against his hip, 3 fragile leaves that might be enough or might not. He didn't look back. The first gray light of dawn bled across the eastern mesas, turning the sky from bruised purple to a dull, reluctant gold. Kai rode the last stretch at a weary trot, the horse's flanks dark with sweat, head-low ears pinned back from exhaustion. The animal had given everything on the return hooves, pounding the uneven trail lungs, heaving through the cold night air, and now it stumbled twice as the town came into view. Kai eased the reins, sliding down before the horse could falter again. He walked the final 200 yards, boots dragging in the dust each step, sending fresh spikes of pain up his calves and into his lower back. The night sage pouch slapped lightly against his hip, 3 fragile leaves inside wrapped in a scrap of cloth. They felt heavier than the saddlebags he'd left behind. He no longer carried fear. What remained was something denser, slower, a weight that settled deep in his chest, the knowledge that he carried someone else's life in that small leather bag. He had chosen this path in the moment he'd spurred the horse into the canyon, and every mile back had sealed it. There was no undoing it now. No slipping away quiet like before. Whatever happened in the next minutes would mark him. Mark her mark the town in ways no one could walk away from clean. Mescalero Crossing looked smaller. In the dawn light, the buildings huddled together like they were trying to hold themselves upright. Smoke drifted thin from a few chimneys, but the street was alive in a way it shouldn't have been at this hour. Lanterns still burned inside the trading post, yellow light leaking through the cracks. Voices carried low, angry overlapping. The crowd had not dispersed. They milled outside the door shadows, shifting boots, scuffing the boards. Cal Decker stood in the middle of the road, legs braced wide, Winchester cradled in his arms. His eyes were red-rimmed face, unshaven shirt, rumpled from a night without sleep. He looked like a man who had stared at the same door for hours, waiting for it to give up its secrets. Kai kept walking. The horse followed at his shoulder, head down, blowing softly. Dust coated his clothes, his hair, his face. It cracked when he blinked. The pouch at his belt was the only clean thing about him, 3 leaves that might save her, or might not. He could still circle around to the back alley, slip in unseen, by a few more minutes before the storm broke. But every second he wasted was a second Nora might not have. The choice wasn't really a choice anymore. He stepped onto the main street. The crowd noticed him in pieces first, one head turning, then another, then a ripple of silence spreading outward like a stone dropped in still water. Voices died. Boots stopped shifting. Even the wind seemed to pause. Kai kept his pace, steady eyes forward, hand resting light on the pouch. He could feel their stares like hot coals on his skin, suspicion, anger, something close to awe that no one wanted to name. Cal Decker raised the rifle, slow, deliberate barrel, leveling at Kai's chest. "Stop right there, Apache." The words cut the quiet like a knife through hide. Cal's voice was hoarse, cracked from shouting and lack of sleep. "Drop whatever you're carrying." Kai stopped. The horse halted beside him, snorting once low. The dawn light caught the sweat on its neck and the faint tremble in its legs. Kai's own hands ached, torn from thorns, stiff from the ride, but he kept them visible, palms half turned. The pouch hung open at his side leaves, just visible inside. The crowd waited. No one breathed loud enough to break the hush. Kai met Cal's eyes across the dust. No words yet. Just the slow rise and fall of his chest, the weight of the night still riding his shoulders, and the small leather bag that held everything left to say. The rifle stayed steady. The trading post felt smaller in the dawn light, the air inside thick with the smell of stale coffee grounds, old leather, and the faint, acrid bite of gunpowder that had drifted in from the street. Thin bars of sunlight slipped through the shutter cracks, falling across the plank floor in pale stripes. Nora lay curled on the chair, now knees drawn up tight to her chest, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold her own body together. Her breaths came in shallow, ragged hitches, each one louder than the last. Every few seconds, her shoulders jerked small convulsions that rattled the chair legs against the boards. Her eyes were half open, still glassy, still chasing shadows no one else could see. Sweat darkened the front of her dress, plastering it to her skin. Kai pushed the door shut behind him, with his boot, the latch, clicking into place like a final breath. The pouch at his belt felt heavier than it should, 3 leaves no more. He crossed the room in 3 strides, knees buckling from the night's ride, and dropped to one knee in front of her. Dust sifted off his clothes, settling on the floor like fine ash. His hands, torn, blood-streaked from thorns, trembled when he reached into the pouch. He pulled out the first leaf, silvery green, and slightly wilted its edges, curled from the long ride. For the first time since he'd left the canyon, something like hope stirred in his chest, small, fragile, almost painful. It wasn't triumph. It was just the bare possibility that she might come back from whatever fire was burning through her mind, that she might open her eyes tomorrow and know her own name again. He hadn't realized how much he needed that until now. Nora's breathing turned harsher, almost wheezing. Her fingers dug into the chair, arms' knuckles bleaching white. Outside, the pounding on the front door hadn't stopped, fists hammering, wood voices rising in ragged waves. Someone shouted, muffled but clear. "She's still in there." "Open up." Kai ignored it. He lifted the leaf to his own mouth, first bit off a small piece, chewed once. The taste exploded bitter, as quinine sharp enough to make his tongue go numb almost instantly. He swallowed, grimacing, then held the rest out so she could see. "Not poison," he said, voice rough from dust and silence. "It'll help. Trust me." Her head lolled toward him, eyes struggling to focus. She didn't speak, just stared, lips parted, trembling. He had to move fast. Waiting for her to take it herself might cost seconds she didn't have. But forcing it meant risking her teeth in his hand during one of those spasms, or her choking if she fought. He hesitated only a heartbeat, then cupped her chin gently with his free hand, steadying her. "Open," he murmured. She did, barely. He placed the leaf on her tongue. Chew. Slow. Nora's jaw worked weakly, teeth grinding the leaf. Tears welled up, spilling down her cheeks, not from pain exactly, but from the sheer bitterness that filled her mouth. She swallowed once, throat working hard, then again, forcing the second mouthful down. A small shudder ran through her whole body. Kai stayed close, one hand still on her cheek, the other braced on the chair arm. He watched her face, every flicker, every twitch, searching for any sign the medicine was taking hold. Then her body went rigid. Every muscle locked at once. Her eyes snapped wide pupils shrinking from black pools to pinpricks. A final, violent tremor ripped through her shoulders, arching off the chair, back fingers clawing the wood. Then she collapsed forward, limp head dropping against his shoulder. Kai froze. His breath stopped in his throat. He could feel her heartbeat against his chest, fast, erratic, then slowing. The pounding outside seemed very far away. He didn't move, didn't speak, just weighted arms still around her, listening to the faint, unsteady rhythm of her breathing in the sudden, terrible quiet. The first true rays of sunrise cut through the shutter slats like thin knives, striking Nora full in the face. She flinched at the brightness, then slowly, almost fearfully, lifted her head. Her hands rose, trembling fingertips brushing her own cheeks, as if testing the texture of skin she hadn't felt in hours. The motion was tentative, like someone waking from a long fever dream and discovering their body still belonged to them. Her hair hung in damp strings across her shoulders. Her dress was wrinkled and stained with dust and sweat. But her eyes, when they finally focused, were clear. The wild, glassy sheen was gone. The pupils had shrunk to normal size, hazel again, sharp and searching. She sat up straighter back, leaving the chair, spine straightening with visible effort. A small sound escaped her, a soft, surprised exhale, almost a laugh, but too fragile for that. She looked around the dim interior of the trading post shelves of canned peaches and bolt cloth, the faint smell of coffee grounds and old wood, the dust motes drifting in the new light. Then her gaze settled on Kai. He was still kneeling where he'd been, one hand resting on the arm of her chair, the other loose at his side. His face was streaked with trail dust, eyes shadowed from the night shoulders, rounded with fatigue. He hadn't moved since her body had gone still. Now he watched her silent, waiting for the verdict in her expression. Nora's lips parted. She swallowed once, throat working hard against the rawness left by the night. Her eyes searched his, really searched, taking in the torn skin on his hands, the blood dried dark on his knuckles, the exhaustion carved into every line of him. Something shifted in her face. Not simple gratitude, recognition. A deep quiet, knowing that the man in front of her had ridden through darkness and rattlesnakes, and a loaded rifle pointed at his back, all for her. For a stranger who'd asked him to put a berry in her mouth. "You saved my life," she said. The words came out hoarse, cracked from disuse, but steady. Clear. Kai didn't answer right away. He only gave a single small nod, barely a movement, but enough. His eyes never left hers. Outside, the shouting had stopped. The pounding fists had fallen silent. In its place came a heavier hush, the kind that presses against the ears. "Someone maybe," Rusty Boone muttered low. "She's been in there too long." The words hung in the air, unfinished, uneasy. Nora drew a long breath. She placed both palms on the chair arms and pushed herself up. Her legs shook violently the moment her weight shifted. Her knees buckled halfway. A flush of shame crept across her cheeks. She hated how weak she still was, how her body refused to obey after everything it had endured. She reached out instinctively, fingers finding Kai's shoulder. He didn't flinch. He simply braced, letting her steady herself against him until the trembling eased. She stood there a moment, leaning into his support, breathing slow. The contact felt strange, too close, too real, but necessary. She could stay inside these walls. Let the door stay shut. Let Kai face whatever waited on the other side alone. She could hide from the stares, the whispers that would follow her for years, the schoolteacher who lost her mind, who needed an Apache to pull her back from it. She could protect what little dignity she had left. Or she could walk out there and speak the truth. Her hand slid from his shoulder. She straightened as best she could, smoothed her skirt with shaking fingers, then turned towards the front door. The bolt was still drawn. She reached up, fingers closing around the iron latch. The metal felt cold against her palm. She paused, took one deep, steadying breath that lifted her chest and let it fall. Then she pushed the door open. Sunlight flooded in, bright and merciless. A wall of faces stared back, dozens of them settlers, frozen mid-step mouths, half-open eyes wide. Cal Decker's rifle was still raised, barrel glinting. Jed Crow's arms were crossed tight. May Harlan stood closest, hand pressed to her throat. The silence stretched thick and taut. Nora stepped forward into the light, Kai a half-step behind her, both of them framed in the doorway like figures stepping out of a dream no one wanted to remember. Every eye locked on them, and waited. The door swung wide on dry hinges, letting the full glare of morning sun flood the threshold. Dust motes danced in the sudden brightness, swirling like tiny ghosts caught in the light. Nora stood framed in the opening, one hand braced on the jamb to steady herself, the other loose at her side. Her dress hung wrinkled and stained hair still tangled from the night, but she held her chin up, spine straight, despite the tremor in her knees. Kai remained a half-step behind her, close enough to catch her, if she fell far enough to give her the space to speak. He said nothing. His silence was a wall, quiet and unyielding, bearing the weight of every stare that landed on him. The street lay hushed. Dozens of faces turned towards them, settlers, frozen mid-motion mouths, parted eyes wide with the shock of seeing her upright and whole. The wind scuffed along the boardwalk, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and cooling horse sweat. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft creak of the door settling against the wall. Nora felt the shame rise first, hot and sharp in her chest, like a brand pressed to skin. They were looking at her the way people look at someone who has come back from something unclean. She knew what they saw, the schoolteacher who had climbed a wagon like a madwoman, who had laughed and babbled and begged a stranger to put something in her mouth. She knew the stories that would follow her now, whispered over fences and in church pews for years to come. But beneath the shame lay something harder, something that burned steady resolve. She had almost died last night. She had almost lost herself. And the man behind her had ridden through darkness to bring her back. If she stayed silent now, he would carry the blame alone. She couldn't let that stand. Cal Decker still held the Winchester-leveled finger, resting light on the trigger guard. His eyes flicked between Nora and Kai, uncertain for the first time. Jed Crow stood with arms crossed, jaw set, eyes narrowed to slits. Rusty Boone took one slow step backward, boot scraping the dirt. May Harlan was closest, handkerchief twisted in her hands, eyes red and shining with unshed tears. Nora drew a breath that hurt all the way down her throat, raw from screaming, from crying, from the poison that had scorched her from the inside. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. When she spoke, her voice cracked at first, then steadied loud enough to carry over the wind. People of Mescalero Crossing. Each word scraped her throat like gravel. I want to set the record straight. The silence deepened thick enough to lean on. I was dying. She swallowed once, painfully. The heat, the berry. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't breathe. Kai saved my life. Without him, I wouldn't be standing here. The words hung in the air. She felt them settle into the crowd like stones dropped into still water, ripples moving outward, changing the surface whether anyone wanted them to or not. Her hands shook at her sides. She clenched them into fists to hide it. Cal Decker lowered the rifle slowly, barrel dipping toward the ground. The motion was careful, almost reluctant. May Harlan let out a small, choked sound and pressed the handkerchief to her mouth. But Jed Crow took one deliberate step forward, His boots thudded on the boards. He looked at Nora, then past her to Kai, and his voice came low-edged with something that wasn't quite anger, something colder. She's still not right in the head. The accusation landed soft, but it carried. A few heads turned. Whispers stirred again, faint at first, then spreading. Nora didn't flinch. She held Jed's gaze chin up through her pulse hammered in her ears. Behind her, Kai remained still. No words, no defense, just the quiet weight of his presence, the faint smell of sage and horse and blood on his hands. The street waited. No one moved. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last coolness of dawn. Dust hung in the air like fine gold stirred by the slow shuffle of boots as the crowd began to thin. Settlers drifted back toward porches and wagons, shoulders loosening, though no one moved quickly. The street felt wider now, emptier, but the weight of what had just happened lingered, pressing down on every surface, like heat trapped in stone. Nora stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame to keep her upright. Her legs still trembled beneath her skirt muscles, weak from the night's ordeal, but she refused to sit. She felt the relief, first sharp, almost painful, as the immediate threat of rifles and fists ebbed away. She had spoken. She had stood between Kai and the mob's anger. But relief came tangled with something heavier, the slow, sick realization that her name would never sound the same in this town again. The whispers would follow her schoolmarm gone mad, saved by an Apache, maybe even something worse. The thought stung deeper than she expected. She had come here to teach children their letters, to build something steady. Now she carried a stain no amount of quiet days could wash away. Kai stood just behind her, silent as ever. He hadn't moved to defend himself, hadn't spoken to contradict Jed Crow's low mutter. He simply endured the stares the way a man endures a long ride in the rain, head steady, eyes forward, taking the discomfort without complaint. May Harlan stepped forward first. Her boots scuffed the board softly. She reached up and placed a gentle hand on Nora's shoulder, fingers trembling just a little. "You did right, child," she whispered, voice thick. "You spoke true." Her eyes were still red, but there was a small, proud light in them. Nora managed a weak nod, throat too tight for words. Jed Crow turned away without another glance. His shoulders stayed rigid as he walked toward his horse. "This town won't forget," he muttered loud enough to carry. A few heads nodded in agreement. Others looked away, uneasy. Rusty Boone lingered longest. He stared at Kai with an expression caught between fear and something closer to respect, eyes wide, mouth half open as if seeing the man for the first time. Then he swallowed, tipped his hat, once awkward, uncertain, and backed away into the thinning crowd. Nora's fingers tightened on the doorframe. She could feel the weakness creeping back into her knees, the ache in her throat from speaking so loud. She knew the whispers would last months. Years, maybe. Every time she walked into the mercantile, every time she stood before her students, someone would remember. But she had bought Kai time. That was enough for now. Kai shifted slightly. He stepped past her out onto the porch and walked toward the hitch rail where his horse waited head low, still breathing hard from the night's run. He reached the saddlebags, paused, then turned back toward the trading post. Without a word, he picked up the small leather pouch from the counter, the one that had held the night sage, and set it down again, leaving it behind. The leaves were gone. The medicine had done its work. There was nothing left to prove. Nora turned to watch him. Her eyes stung hot and sudden. She opened her mouth, voice barely above a whisper. "I owe you more than thanks." Kai looked at her, then really looked. His face was still streaked with dust hands, still marked with dried blood and thorn scratches. He gave a small shake of his head. "You owe me nothing," he said quietly, You survived. That's enough. The words landed soft final. He held her gaze a moment longer, then turned away. He walked to his horse, untied the reins with slow, deliberate movements. The animal lifted its head ears, flicking. Kai swung into the saddle, settling into the familiar creak of leather. He didn't look back. Nora watched him go. Her eyes blurred, tears spilling over despite her effort to hold them. The crowd continued to scatter, some heading home, some lingering to talk in low voices. Whispers drifted on the wind. Apache. Saved her. Did you see how he just... She stood up for him. The breeze picked up swirling dust into a thin veil that blurred the line between street and sky. Kai's horse took a few slow steps, then another carrying him toward the edge of town. Nora stayed in the doorway, one hand still on the frame, watching until the dust swallowed him whole. The whispers kept on, soft and persistent, like the wind itself. The sun stood high over Mescalero Crossing by noon, bleaching the street to bone white and turning every shadow sharp-edged. The town had slipped back into its ordinary rhythm, the rhythmic clang of a hammer on iron from the blacksmith's shop, the slow groan of a freight wagon rolling past, the faint jingle of trace chains, and the low bellow of oxen. Dust rose in lazy plumes behind the wheels, settling again on porch rails and windowsills. Life went on, but the air still carried a heaviness like the aftermath of a storm that hadn't quite finished breaking. Kai rode out at a walk, reins loose in his hand. The horse moved with the tired, steady gait of an animal that had given everything and still had miles left to give. His shadow stretched long behind him, dark against the pale earth, reaching back toward the town he was leaving. He sat straight in the saddle face, unreadable beneath the brim of his hat hands, resting easy on the horn. He didn't feel like a hero. He hadn't ridden into the canyon to prove anything. He had gone because staying would have meant watching a woman die when he could still do something about it. That was all. The rest, the stares, the whispers, the rifle barrel pointed at his chest, was just the price. Inside the trading post, Nora stood at the window, one hand pressed flat against the glass. The cool pain felt good against her palm. Her body still ached in places she couldn't name, a deep, dull soreness that reminded her how close she had come to not waking up at all. She watched Kai's horse move down the road, the rider small now against the vastness of the desert beyond town. Her throat tightened. She knew both of them had been changed in ways that couldn't be spoken aloud. She had stood in front of a crowd and spoken for him, and in doing so, she had marked herself forever. The town would remember. They would talk. The story would grow legs of its own, some kinder, some crueler, until the truth became just another thread in the telling. May Harlan remained the only one still there. She stood a few paces back, arms folded, watching Kai's silhouette grow smaller. Her eyes moved from the departing rider to Nora, soft, with something like sorrow and pride mixed together. She had seen too many stories twist over the years, good deeds turned sour, brave acts forgotten or maligned. This one would be no different. She knew it would be told 100 times around supper tables and porch rails, each version wearing away a little more of the raw fact, until only the shape remained. Kai reached the edge of town. He could have turned back, ridden right up to the trading post again, faced the long looks and the muttered questions, stayed to prove he wasn't the man they feared. But staying would have meant more eyes on him, more chances for trouble to find him later. Leaving meant letting Nora carry the weight of the aftermath alone. He felt the pull of both choices heavy in his chest, but he didn't hesitate. He touched his heels lightly to the horse's flanks. The animal lifted its head, stepped forward, and kept going straight into the open desert. Kai did not look back. Nora watched until the heat haze swallowed him whole. Her fingers curled against the glass. A single word slipped out, barely audible, more breath than sound. "Thank you." She stepped away from the window. Her hand reached up slow and pushed the sash down. The pane slid shut with a quiet click. Outside, the wind picked up. It swept along the street, lifting dust into thin veils that drifted and settled again. Somewhere far off in the direction of the Black Range, the canyon wind keened through the rocks, a low, steady moan that carried no answer. The town kept moving hammer strikes wagon wheels, voices rising and falling. But beneath it all lay a quiet scar, two people marked by a single night, a single choice, and the space between them that would never quite close. The dust kept blowing, and the story kept waiting to be told. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for giving your time to this story. Some journeys shape us, and we hope this one left a mark on your heart. There are more paths ahead, more legends of love, hardship, and redemption beneath the western sky. Please subscribe, leave your thoughts, and travel with us once again. Thank you, and God bless. Aviso Legal/Disclaimer. The stories presented here are creative expressions and may mix historical inspiration with dramatized scenes. AI tools contribute to some elements of voice imagery and structure, but every published story is refined by editors and creators to ensure authentic emotional impact. We honor YouTube's policies and do not generate deceptive likenesses or artificial depictions of real people. All audiovisual components are legally licensed. Any use, redistribution, or alteration of this content must be granted through written consent. Your presence here means a lot. Thank you for supporting artistic storytelling.